Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Good morning. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to a really excellent conference so far. I've learned a lot already, and also for the opportunity to speak here. So as you can see on this slide, I'm indeed from the Infectious Disease Unit in DG Research and Innovation. But in preparing this presentation and for this subject, I've worked very closely with colleagues in the ethics, responsible for the ethics in our directorate, and also, and in particular, for the first two parts of the presentation, with colleagues in DG Trade, the Directorate General for the Common Commercial Policy, because they are actually the ones who are responsible for the implementation and for the policy, for the export control policy. I also realize that there are many experts in the room who probably know more on certain subjects that I'm going to deal with than I do, and I really would like to invite them to then correct or complement what I say in the discussion. That is a little bit inherent in the position that I have, that I don't have in all issues the detailed knowledge of academic experts that are here. I'm actually going to start with an overview of the EU export control policy. Then I'm going to talk indeed about the provisions for research in this policy and legislation. And then I'm going to talk in the third part a little bit more about what is closer to home, about the considerations for dual-use research in our funding program in Horizon 2020 and in the health and demographic change and well-being societal challenge, which is the part of Horizon 2020 that our directorate is implementing. So EU export controls, the definition of dual-use items in the legislation is items including software and technology which can be used for both civil and military purposes. As all or many of you are aware, the historic background, of course, of this is very much hard material, tangible things, control of proliferation of nuclear weapons in particular and weapons of mass destruction. You see the microbiological picture in there too, but that is definitely a concern that I think has only come in more recently and still somewhat marginally if you look at the legislation. So as I mentioned, the export controls in historical perspective have to be seen to the political events of proliferation, which you see on the left side of this slide, accompanied by a multitude of international treaties and international arrangements, which I'm going to show in a little more detail in the next slide. That's the middle column. And then on the right, you see the EU response in trade controls resulting in the current legislation, the Regulation 428 from 2009. There are a number of international treaties, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological and Toxins Weapon Convention, which we just heard about, and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540. There are then a number of what is called multilateral arrangements. These are groups that define, or one particular task of these groups. This is the Australia Group, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and the Wassenaar arrangements. These are all groups that in certain fields, in particular, define the technical specification of those issues, items, technologies that are that fall under these export control regulations, and which in most instances are then implemented as annexes to these national legislations as well as to the EU legislation. There is a European security strategy and a strategy against the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There is Article 207 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which is the which defines the competence of the European Commission in the common commercial policy. And there's then the regulation that we just mentioned, and I think there's a typo in one of them. I think actually 408 is correct and not 428. And there are then, of course, also national regulations. There's also an institutional framework for this at the EU level. There are, as again, on very, very general terms, all of you know the Council and the European Parliament as co-legislators. We have at the Council level the dual-use working party. We also have a non-proliferation group in the treaty. In the Parliament, we have the Inter Committee, the Committee on International Trade that deals with this. The Commission has three main tasks: policy development, the prerogative for legislative proposals, which need to come from the Commission, and then coordination and monitoring of the implementation, which in many instances is then member states' prerogative. That is what is meant there by member states' administrations. Member states are the licensing authorities, but also the customs and law enforcement authorities for this regulation. The European Court of Justice has played a crucial role in the 90s, where it has confirmed that these export controls do indeed fall under the common commercial policy, i.e., responsibility of the Commission, even if they pursue primarily security objectives. You know that the common foreign security policy is, of course, governed by different arrangements than the common commercial policy. And then the dialogue with industry is very important because this is a regulation, which means it's directly applicable, which means it's industry's responsibility to comply with these rules and to make the first assessment on classifications, on these classifications. The basic feature of this regulation are the, in principle, free circulation of dual-use items on EU territory, with very few exceptions. Then there is a common export control list. This is a very long positive list of items that do fall under these export controls, which are, as I mentioned, mostly defined by the multilateral regimes. The regulation then sets common control and authorization criteria. It also offers the possibility to control non-listed items that are not in this positive list, the so-called catch-all phrase, which says that if something is related to the construction of weapons of mass destruction or to military end use, then of course it also falls under this regulation, even if it is not listed in this Annex 1. There is the possibility of additional national controls for public security and for human rights considerations. The transit through EU territory and brokering of dual-use items are also controlled. It also includes, and I'll come to that in more detail, intangible technology transfers, very important for the purposes of this conference, of course, and it also covers intangible means of communication. Now, this is maybe a little bit more detail than we need for the purpose of this conference, but still, just to mention, there are four basic types of licenses that are given under this regulation. There are EU general export authorizations, which cover a number of items which are allowed to be exported to a limited number of countries. Member states can, in addition, issue national general export authorizations for a large number of items. Now, again, certain items are excluded from those national general export authorizations. There are global export authorizations, which are given to one exporter for a number of items to, again, a number of countries, or and there are then individual export authorizations to one exporter for the export to one specific destination. As I mentioned, there are common licensing simplifications. So the EU General Export Authorization, there are 6 of them currently. This allows for simplification for the least sensitive goods to the most reliable destinations, and there are additional simplifications possible at the national level. There is also, on a number of areas, not on dual-use research so far as you know, EU guidelines. The EU also fosters the exchange of implementation and best practices. There is a dual-use coordination group with member states experts which assists the Commission in implementing this regulation. There are peer visits and common training. There is, of course, customs coordination. And very importantly, the regulation is enforced by the national authorities, and they also set the penalties in cases of breaches. Now, this is also a dynamic field. Article 25 of the regulation already sets the necessity for regular reporting and proposals for amendments. There was a green paper in 2011, which launched a broad public consultation on a review process of this export control regime. There was a Commission staff working document that summarizes the input to this consultation. There was an implementation report on the implementation of the regulation to the European Parliament and the Council. And this year, in April, there was a Commission communication that sets out the principles of a future or options for a future revision of this legislation. There's now an impact assessment ongoing of these possible future changes in the legislation. And we expect to come up with legislative and non-legislative action in response to this process in 2015, or colleagues from DG Trade. This is the website of DG Trade, which lists more information on this. Now, what does the EU export control policy specifically say about research? What does research actually have to do with this regulation? So Article 2 of the regulation says that dual-use items shall mean items including software and technology which can be used for both civil and military purposes. So it's through the technology that research actually comes in. Technology means specific information necessary for the development, production, or use of goods. This information takes the form of technical data or of technical assistance. We have again definitions for technical assistance, which may take forms such as instructions, skills, training, working knowledge, consulting services, and may involve the transfer of technical data. And technical data are blueprints, plans, diagrams, models, formula, tables, engineering designs, and so on. What is basic scientific research? That is also defined in the regulation. It means experimental or theoretical work undertaken principally to acquire new knowledge of the fundamental principles of phenomena or observable facts, not primarily directed towards a specific practical aim or objective. And then there's a very important exception in the Annex 1, which is the positive list of items that fall under the control of this regulation, which says that controls on technology transfer do not apply to information in the public domain, to basic scientific research, the definition of which we've just heard, or to the minimum necessary information for patent applications. Now, the crucial question is gain-of-function research, and we're narrowing down, as you see, to the subject of this conference. Is that basic research in the sense of that regulation? Now, there has so far been one attempt or one controversy about this question, and that was that in 2011, Dutch export control authorities actually claimed that, yes, a manuscript from the Erasmus Medical Center on H5N1 influenza virus engineered to be aerosol transmissible between ferrets does require an export license before transfer to the US. Now, we'll come to this issue of transfer to the US. The Erasmus Medical Center complied with this requirement, but did so under protest. It did get the license required in April, and then the manuscript that all of you know was published in Science in June 2012. Now, when I say it did so under protest, it means it filed an administrative appeal not on the license decision, which was positive, which was an approval, but on the license requirement. This administrative appeal was then rejected by the Dutch Minister of Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation, and this decision was then contested in court by the Erasmus Medical Center. I've tried to summarize the arguments of the Dutch court. They say, yes, this does fall under the export control regulation, because based on the preamble and the objective of this regulation, any exception to license requirements must be interpreted restrictively. Otherwise, the regulation loses its purpose. They say it cannot be left up to individual researchers to decide whether their research is basic. They say even though Erasmus Medical Center has only used known and available methods, the research has led to completely new results, and the information could be used for a biological weapon. They also attach great value to the initial NSABB recommendation in that year against the full publication of this article. And they claim that the objective was specifically to develop an aerosol transmissible avian influenza virus, hence this was not basic research. But the challenge to this decision in the appellate court is still pending. Now, what are counter-arguments or questions to this issue? The question really is it basic or is it applied research? There is the argument that this is not primarily about creating a dangerous airborne virus, but that this is primarily about fundamental understanding of airborne transmission. There's the question, is this really new technology, or was the technology basically already there in the public domain, and we've just applied it to a specific case? There is the important question of freedom of science. Does this constitute censorship, to which we'll hear another talk this afternoon? There's a very important question. Now, this is the first time that this issue was raised. Is there a level playing field in the EU, and even less so probably internationally? How are these export controls applied? And there's the somewhat curious question of what does publication actually constitute an export? Now, this was Science, a US journal. Would the decision of the court or of the ministry have been different if this had been a European journal? I think we all realize that this is quite a strange question if you look at the effect of that. What does the communication that I just mentioned of the Commission on the future of the export control policy say to this? Well, it recognizes a number of the issues that are outdated in the current regulation. It says that it will examine options to promote a specific strategy to ensure immaterial control and address the challenge posed by intangible transfers of technology, including the need to clarify the control of dual-use research. It says it will review the legal provisions and/or provide guidance relating to basic notions applying to electronic transfers of control technology, shifting the focus on pre-transfer control provisions such as registration or self-auditing and post-transfer monitoring such as compliance audits rather than the transmission itself. It does mention the option for targeted and coordinated outreach for academic research communities, which should raise awareness. And it mentions that other options could also include the preparation of a code of conduct for scientists engaged in the performance of dual-use research. Now, in the last part of my presentation, I'm really switching gears. This has nothing directly to do with the export control policy. This is the question, how do we now, as a funding agency and not as a legislator, deal with this question of dual-use research in Horizon 2020. And the reason that I add there Societal Challenge 1, which is the health challenge, is because this is, of course, different in the security challenge. There's a specific societal challenge also on secure societies, where, of course, the purpose of this research is very different than in our health challenge. So as well as in the previous funding program, FP7, in the health theme, and in our societal challenge, this dual-use research is exceedingly rare. Actually, as far as we are aware, in FP7, there are 3 out of more than 1,000 projects which contain any dual-use component, and these dual-use components and these are all gain-of-function experiments. The purpose in our challenge is always the civil or the health use, actually. The military or malevolent use is, if at all, an unintended byproduct of this research. Now, the 3 projects that we have with gain-of-function components are listed here. They all deal with re-emerging infectious diseases, with issues of the emergence of zoonotic viruses and the transmission between animals and humans. Importantly, these projects were not selected in response to a specific call for proposals on gain-of-function research, but you see here the 2 calls in response to which these 3 projects were selected. One is on strengthening research on prediction, identification, modeling, and surveillance of newly emerging infectious diseases in humans, and on the identification of factors promoting the emergence of pathogens with human pandemic potential from pathogens with a zoonotic background and related prevention strategies. And in these 3 projects, the gain-of-function component was mentioned as one, in the context of these overall 12 million euro projects, a rather minor component. Now, we do have a system, of course, for ethics review, which is very important in our programs. There is extensive guidance for applicants on how to complete your ethics self-assessment, which asks a number of questions and gives reference documents. There is then a screening process and a ethics assessment process. So each successful proposal in our programs undergoes ethical screening by at least 2 ethics experts, with a variety of backgrounds, interdisciplinary background in law, philosophy, medicine, biology. And then 40%, there's a percentage lacking there, of all successful proposals, including all projects containing potential dual use, then undergo a further, more thorough, full ethics assessment with at least 5 ethics experts evaluating each proposal. If needed, we have a separate process for security scrutiny. This ethics review and screening results in an ethics report, which in turn gives either full clearance or conditional clearance subject to compliance with certain requirements, or it can also give no clearance, i.e. refusing the project, i.e. the project would not be funded. Conditional clearance is either implemented prior to the grant agreement through changes or additions to the description of work, which is part of the grant agreement, or during the grant agreement through requirements for permits, follow-up, and also through ethical audits that we conduct. So, for example, in these 3 gain-of-function projects, we then performed an ethical audit with ethical experts of all 3 of these projects. Now, we have received requests of the president of the commission. The previous president of the commission has received 2 requests by the scientific community on the issue of dual use. One was from the European Society of Virology. It was basically offering scientific advice on this issue, and it was asking for a discussion on the potential need for the establishment of an NSABB-like advisory committee at the European level, and to develop workable common policies for scientific research and publications. Another request from the Foundation for Vaccine Research, which was also disputing some of the factual arguments of the European Society for Virology, offered a scientific briefing and asked for a comprehensive risk-benefit assessment of gain-of-function research at the EU level. Now, what are our thoughts or our considerations on this? Now, the first important question is, what should be the scope of these guidelines or of this advisory body or of this risk-benefit assessments? Should it be dual-use research of concern in general? Should it be biological DIRC? Should we focus on gain-of-function mutations, which are currently at the center of the debate? Very importantly, what is truly the added value of such guidance or such a body at the EU level compared to existing documents, guidance documents, or upcoming risk-benefit assessments? Extremely important also, what is our legal competence, our subsidiarity, and the support that we will get from the fact that the European Society of Virology or the Foundation for Vaccine Research are asking for this does not mean that member states will support this, which is crucial, without which we cannot do such, we could not issue such guidelines. Should this only pertain to Horizon 2020 funded research? Should this also have guidance value for research in member states? If we are talking about a committee, should this be an ad hoc committee? Should this be a standing committee? What kind of decisions should they take, or what kind of guidance or recommendations or assessments should they do? And of course, in general, to somehow divide or be careful about the responsibilities of a funding body versus the responsibility of the legislator, regulatory authorities. Now, I realize that the EU in some cases is both, but in research it is actually mostly or exclusively the first and not the second. So we should definitely avoid redundancy and unnecessary red tape in that area. So that's the discussion that I'm looking forward to having with you after the second talk, I think. Thank you.